everybody, this is Lomi, and after last week's fiasco, it's time to move on and see how well these molds I made for Rhyllyn's parts actually work. I'm gonna jump right in by putting a straw into the mold that I made for the arms. If you missed the video that I did last, the reason I'm using drinking straws inside the mold is because that way it'll leave a void inside the piece where I won't have to drill out a channel for the string to go through later. The resin won't adhere to the straw either, so it'll be really easy to pull it out after I have the parts cast. I already have straws on both sides, so it's time to move on to the mixing and pouring of the resin. Since I was using something unfamiliar for the mold making, I decided to stick to the familiar for the casting process, and I'm using Alumilite Amazing Casting Resin, which I've used for all of my eyes and also for the hands that I made for Rune back when I started his modification project several years ago. I am doing one thing slightly different, which is I got some Alumilite resin dye, which is the only kind that works with this quick-set resin. I've never used resin dye before, so I'm not really sure what to expect, but I know I want a really intense green. I mixed it very thoroughly into the B side of the resin, and then poured part A and part B together to blend those. You have to work really quickly with this resin because it starts to cure almost immediately, so you have less than 60 seconds to stir after the two are put together. I used the edge of a popsicle stick to guide the resin down into the pore hole in the top of the mold. This helps keep me from making too much of a mess, although some does manage to escape. I rock the mold a little bit now and then just to make sure that all the air bubbles get out. You can see them kind of bubbling to the surface. One thing I discover right away is that I think maybe my pour tabs weren't quite large enough because there's not really much room for the air to escape. The whole point of having the pour tab at the highest point on the piece is so that the air bubbles can flow up and out that ventilated hole, but I'm not sure it's working too well. As long as you work really quickly and pour additional layers of resin while the first layers are still tacky, they'll fuse together without seam lines, so I try to work quickly in mixing another batch. Since this is quick-set resin, it only takes about 10 minutes to completely cure. But when I open the first hand mold, I see right away that I definitely didn't make this pour tab large enough because I couldn't even get the resin down into the mold very well. I tried to salvage what I had by snipping off the bit that filled the pour tab and pouring more in. Unfortunately, it didn't quite solve the problem because the fingers didn't fill either. It also created a weird marbling effect that I don't really want on these pieces, so I'll have to try that again. But hopefully the arms worked out a little bit better. The bubbles that came up through the pour tab on one side prevent me from being able to pull that piece out of the mold, so I have to cut that off before I can pull it out. It's also kind of tough to get the piece out with the straw in there, especially since this silicone is really stiff. But when I do eventually get the piece out, on the whole, I think it looks okay. However, there are quite a few bubbles, and the seam line on the side is really bad. I thought I could pare it away with my knife, but there were more bubbles underneath. Even so, I think it was pretty good for a first casting. I remove all the parts from the molds, find that they're all unusable, and then I poured another batch. This is the second hand that I poured. And this one turned out pretty good. It has a few oddities about it though. Because the tips of the claws were so incredibly fine, I couldn't get the resin to go down in there, so the claws didn't fully form. And for some reason, the dye collected more heavily down in the slim fingers. And in the other hand that I cast, I have a lot of really weird marbling, even though that hand was poured all at once. Since the dye was behaving really strangely, I figured it might be a better idea to cast something just in white or maybe a really light green and then dye it darker later on. I went ahead and used up the last of the dark green resin that I had, making one piece that's sort of half dark green and half light green, just to see if I could figure out why there were so many bubbles in the mold. But I noticed pretty quickly when I pulled it out that the lighter colored half looked really good, and the dark colored half was really badly bubbled, so I'm pretty sure the bubbles have something to do with the dye. In fact, the dye even seemed to inhibit the resin's ability to cure, because when I went back to look at the darker green parts again, I noticed that the top of them was still a little bit sticky, even several hours later. So that's definitely not going to be usable. I'm not really sure why the resin or dye were behaving this way, because they're made to go together and the hands turned out alright, so it doesn't happen all the time, but that stickiness was definitely concerning for the arms. While I don't consider a little bit of bubbling a deal breaker because I can patch it up and cover it with airbrushing later, I definitely didn't want it to be this bubbled. And you can see that the lighter green piece that I did only had one bubble in it. But when I cast some white pieces, they turned out almost perfectly, even though I don't have high quality casting supplies like a vacuum chamber or pressure pot. So ultimately, I think pouring the resin first and then dyeing it later using something like RIT Dye-More is a much better solution for me. I did ultimately end up getting some hands that will work, even though I'll need to touch up the claws and a few little bubbles with some putty later on. Since they're going to be airbrushed, it's not a big deal. My biggest concern was having places at the wrist where if the paint gets scratched off, it would still look dark. I'm pretty sure that a lot of these problems could be avoided if I was using a vacuum chamber and a pressure pot to remove bubbles from the resin, but I don't have the kind of budget that would allow for that when all I do is hobby work. Since I am just a hobbyist and I'm not going to be doing this all the time, then I think just casting in white resin is the best solution for me. Since the texture on the green hands is a little bit rough compared to the white ones, I may cast white ones and dye them along with the white arms to get what I really want for this doll. But that's a project for later when I'm ready to do the airbrushing. That's all for today though. Thanks for joining me again. Bye.